Much of what shapes conflict never announces itself as crisis. It appears quietly in changing landscapes, neglected spaces, fading livelihoods, and the little things society slowly stop paying attention to. Long before violence becomes visible, perception has already shifted. What we notice, what we ignore, and what we learn to accept as normal all matter. In this episode of the Delimi PROSPER Podcast, we turn our attention to seeing itself, to the ways that pressure becomes invisible, how memory is shaped, and how images, art, and everyday aesthetics influence what societies remember or forget. This is a conversation about perception as a civic skill. My guest is Aisha Aliyu-Bima, a curator, photographer, and writer who grew up in Jos and now works at the intersection of visual culture, memory, and public dialogue. Drawing on lived experience and curatorial practice, she helps us think about how learning to see differently can be an act of prevention and of responsibility. Aisha Aliyu-Bima is a Nigerian curator, photographer, and writer whose work explores how societies see, remember, and narrate themselves. She currently serves as Director of Arts of the African School of Economics in Abuja, where she works at the intersection of visual culture, research, and public dialogue. Growing up in Jos, Aisha developed an early sensitivity to how places change quietly. The ways that environmental pressure, social tension, and neglect often become normal long before they are named by everyone as problems. Her curatorial and photographic practice draws on this awareness, focusing on questions of visibility, memory, and whose experiences are rendered legible or, alternatively, erased over time. Through exhibitions, research, and writing, she engages with contemporary African art as a way of thinking critically about identity, space, and power. Aisha Aliyu-Bima's work challenges audiences to consider not only what is shown, but what is overlooked, and how the ethics of seeing shapes public understanding, conflict, and the very possibilities for peace. Aisha, looking back at, from the vantage of where you are now, in both your life and, of course, your career, what kinds of social pressures were present early in Jos which were not quickly recognized as problems? And then, of course, you've had a very global practice. Have you seen these at play in other communities?
I think I see them at play now sometimes, and I'll just say that before I reverse or go back to the start of your question. I think even as young as I was, I remember one thing. This particular memory I strongly remember before the first Jos crisis, and I was really young, about 4 years old. But I remember going back to Islamia. I skipped a day because there was a family friend's birthday party that I had to, of course, attend.
Definitely.
Yeah, and then I got back to Islamia the next day, and I remember, the malam was like, "Why weren't you here the day before?" And I said, "Oh, I attended a birthday party."
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, "Okay." We resumed, finished, and then after, or I think when we went out for a break, a group of girls suddenly refused to play with me. And me, I asked questions directly. I'm like, "Why do you not want to play with me?"
Yeah.
And they said, "Oh, you're going to birthday parties, and birthday parties are for Christians." And it was just really shocking for me that, we're little kids. Why do we care, first of all? But yeah, every time I look back at that moment, I think the reason I felt the chills I did at that time is that, and perhaps maybe I noticed a lot of other things that were happening. I don't know, but I know that I can remember that exact. And I think it was a sort of foreshadowing of what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And I'm someone with very vivid childhood memories, especially when it comes to Jos. And I think because the adults around me, they never really treated me like a child in how they spoke to me. I was a lot more aware of what was going on than maybe other children my age would have been. But a few months after that happened, we had the first crisis.
September.
Yeah, I remember being in my grandmother's house and we smelt or felt the irritation of tear gas and crowds running because her house is a few streets away from the stadium. Exactly. Yes. And our first inclination was that, it's probably a fight between Mighty Jets and
Plateau United
fans. And then it turned out that it wasn't that. I remember because we were in that house because we had been picked up from school and we were waiting for my mom to close from the office and, come as the routine went. And I remember my mom driving in the craziest manner into the street and she had a police escort and she's like, get in the car, we're going home. And there was a little tussle with my grandmother, you have to come. And my grandmother was like, I'm not going
She's in her house.
Yeah, and then, being shut, driving back to the house, being locked up in the house for the period that we were, and then slowly emerging from that to realize that this is what has happened and all of the framings, it did very much feel like a religious conflict at the time. But after the religious conflict, I had to, as a Muslim child and with my Muslim sisters, resume the next Monday at our very Catholic school. So, it was a very sort of, maybe in a way that we don't have the words to articulate at the time, but a very jarring experience because everywhere else, they're telling you that Muslims and Christians are at war in this city. And then you have to go to school and meet your Christian friends and your Christian teachers and life goes on. So it's who are the people? Because clearly I'm here and we're not killing each other. Yeah. And these people do not hate me and I do not hate these people. And I'm being told that outside of these walls. So it creates this sort of fragmented reality. But I think definitely the signs were there. And in the numerous other iterations of the crisis, I think you could always tell by sort of the conversations that were happening around town, by people moving in more into like ethnic enclaves, into religious enclaves, sort of rallying around, I guess, to find safety, to find camaraderie, but at the same time, in even trying to find that safety and comfort against this boogeyman. Because in a way, it does feel like, as I said, this fragmented reality, because I'm very certain that my Christian neighbor is not going to kill me. And I think they have that certainty as well. But then again, we're being told at the same time that Muslims are Christians. Because at the time, in the early 2000s, the dialogue had not even really evolved. This was right in the heat of the moment. So people had not even started looking at the greater conditions that made ripe for this crisis. The sort of poverty that was plaguing the city, the competition for resources, the climate change, and like how ownership of land had become something more serious. All of the economic changes that were driving, some of the causes of this conflict. It was sensational at the time. And so I think in the many iterations, we learn to pick up the signs that things like this are coming. And now on the internet, it's very ripe. There's almost a pattern for these conversations. And you can even identify sometimes who's pulling the strings behind these conversations. Like, what is the interest in the conversation? You learn about the foreign interests that have interests in this conflict that plays out in your little town.
Neighborhood.
And the global impacts of it. You learn very much about the personal impacts of it because it means you moving away from your childhood home into a place that is more secure in a way, but it also means you creating new memories, missing that sense of neighborliness that you had and all of that. You see the city itself shift and mold itself into something very, very different from what you knew as a result of this conflict. Yeah.
Some forms of harm don't look like conflict at all. As you've stated, they arrive very slowly. So as a visual thinker who has curated an exhibition on composite people, geographies, spaces, particularly of northern Nigeria, your Arewa exhibition at the Shiloh Museum, how do you understand this idea of slow, invisible pressure?
I think it's something that's almost intuitive to me at this point, because it is something that I've seen. I've seen the macro of the crises. I've seen the micro of it. I've seen, how it happens when it's just your uncle being trapped in a vehicle that they're pouring petroleum on, and he survives that and shutters himself in the room, and the different methods he goes through to sort of shed that trauma and that identity. And I've also seen its implication on the larger city, as I said, in the migration, in people moving to streets because, they feel it is more Christian, and people moving, and slowly how that actually creates
the creation of ghettos.
Yes, people ghettoize themselves, but at the same time, you can see a direct geographical separation, right? And my grandmother's house sits, interestingly enough, in the middle of one of these large. Okay, so you see the micro of it, you see the macro impact of like these conflicts and how it creates direct geographical impacts in the way that people choose to live and in the way that people migrate. So directly, you see the city become divided into like a Muslim area and a Christian area, and how that begins to affect the way people interact and exchange with each other. So having this sort of large and internal scope of it, I think it's very intuitive for me to see how different things beyond our control affect what we do, but also how we are socialized as well, which is a big thing when it comes to identity. Because for me, your socialization, I think, always overrides whatever identity you think it is that you have. I am, for one, more interested in where people were born and where they grew up than where they are from. In the Nigerian context, that doesn't do very much for me in terms of sort of knowing a person or what they're interested in or how they relate to the land. Because, what is to say if you are from Zamfara or from Enugu or wherever, but you're born in Jos, you're used to the cold, you're used to the air, you're used to the vegetables, you're used
being surrounded by mountains everywhere you go.
You're used to the terrain, you're used to meeting very many different people and exchanging with them and sort of having a broader view of, again, what life can be. And I think that really plays into my work, because I tried to, and now curation is not very much directly influential to the audience as much as the art is. But in the way that I try to present the art is to allow people experience that wonder and that curiosity of approaching another human being, another person, another idea without any preconceived notions. And, it's even something fundamental to how people look at art. I think a lot of us are socialized and taught that, if you look at art, it has to be serious. It has to have some meaning, or you have to project a lot of... You can just, first of all, look at something and see if you enjoy looking at it or not. And then if you enjoy looking at it, you start asking why, what is similar, what is not similar, what do I find interesting about this? And I think if we look at one another and if we look at people like that, I think it makes it easy for us to override a lot of the isms and just see us for who we are, as cliche as that sounds. But I really try to integrate that in my curatorial practice to make sure that people, first of all, are able to see and feel the work or feel the message of the artist before then going into the secondary layers. Who is the artist? In what context did they create this work? How does this work connect to the other work and all of that? But first things first, I want people to be open to feeling and to be open to seeing without any lens, without any preconceived notions or ideas. Yeah.
Thank you. So let's shift to the environment, the biosphere where we live, environmental degradation, spatial neglect, and exclusion often fade into the background, but their very existence shapes conflict in very, very clear and determined ways. So here's my question. What do societies lose when these subtle changes, stop being noticed?
Oh, societies lose a lot. And sometimes I think that's why, especially when it comes to conflict, I think a lot of us must understand what we are really up against. And I will come back to Jos again as an example. In the boogeyman of conflict, and whether people are indigenous or non-indigenous, or whether they're Muslim or Christian or whatever else identity has been labeled on them, we've been so focused on conflict that a lot of the things that made the city great have been neglected. And you see it in terms of the environment, you see it in the quality of education, you see it, you're so focused sometimes on this big thing that what you think you're protecting or what you're fighting for, you end up losing it all. Yeah. And this is a tale as old as time. And I think that when we stop noticing the little things, every single thing, we risk losing it all. It's something on the global scale. It's with climate change. We stop paying attention to the oceans, to what we're throwing in the rivers, to the amount of plastic we're using, and we risk losing the planet entirely. But even on a smaller scale, in our homes, in what we consume, you start clicking a lot of problematic content, and before you know, you're regularly there. And before you know, you're taking those mannerisms of interactions or those traumas that are not your own into the way you relate with people. And that's why, especially now in a time where we're being bombarded by content, by ideas, regulated and unregulated, before, at least in the time between someone writing, finding a site to publish on, and all of that, by the time it reaches you, there's but now people are directly posting, their unfiltered, problematic, inaccurate sometimes ideas, and a lot of people are falling into consuming it, and they don't realize that it's bleeding into how they treat the other person or one another. But I think that we must, and for those of us that notice, we have a responsibility to call people's attention as much as we can to the little things which end up being big problems. Like I say, groundwater supply in Abuja, for example, when every home is forced to dig a borehole, and we're not looking at that statistic. 50 years from now, when groundwater becomes an even more precious resource, will we look back at this time and see, had we known? Should we have enforced the regulations sooner? Should we have brought this to everyone's attention sooner? And I think in a way it also comes to encouraging people to pursue interests as diverse as possible, because it is all important in the larger ecosystem that we live in. It's for our benefit when we have more people curious on several subjects and we encourage that curiosity. And this is why with art and children, I think for me, children are one of the audiences I'm most interested in teaching them, to have that curiosity, to be as interested, to find importance and value in everything else. Someone can be highly interested in mango trees, and in 30 years that person will probably be the one that will save species of Nigerian mangoes. You have to, especially when you're growing, when you're evolving, make sure people are as interested in many things as possible. And I think that's how we're able to stay abreast of all of these subtle changes that end up becoming.
Your work often asks not just what is shown, but what is not shown. Hence my question: who decides? Who decides what becomes visible in public culture and what remains unseen?
Now that's a tricky question to answer because I think the consumer has been convinced that they must see what is shown. But really the reality is that the consumer themselves have power. And I think it's important for all of us to realize sometimes our power and how much we can also influence what is presented to us and what is shown to us. It can be by as little as supporting niche content that you find interesting and sort of supporting the producers of that. But it can also be in big, coordinated and organized ways. But I also think one of the biggest ways that we can sort of advocate for ourselves and what we want is by encouraging younger people to pursue the various ways of expressing themselves, the various mediums. For example, curatorial work. It's not something that's very recognized in Nigeria at large, but then especially in the North. I think it is now with a lot of my peers, Sada Malumfashi, Selma Jae, and Gania, all of yes, exactly, Sabo Padi. This generation, Punch and Cruven in Jos, I think we're the first sort of cohesive and coordinated class of curators coming from Northern Nigeria. And I think in the short period that we've been working, you can see a lot of the changes in the way art from the North is perceived, in the way artists and art institutions from the North are able to exchange. And so what happens if there are 1,000 of us? If there are 1 million of us, right? It becomes a very big thing that has this massive effect in the way people are able to think about themselves, but also in the way that people see us. And I think that's something that's very special when younger people and people that are emerging are given access to present and represent their stories. And there's some people that have started on a curatorial path but discovered something else. And, they've gone onto those paths to support emerging industries. And this is, so for me, curiosity, again, we're back to that, encouraging curiosity, supporting an adventurous sort of thinking. And we always think that this is a liberty that is not ours, or as Black people, as Nigerians, as Africans, we've been convinced that exploring is a liberty that is not ours, but it is really ours. And we have to do it, in the best possible way that we can. I think that's how we become excellent. That's how we are able to shed off some of the things that are holding us back. And that's the way that we'll build the future.
Okay. Let me take that question again. Just go up. Yeah, the question I asked her. Okay, so good. Play. Your work often asks not just what is shown, but what is not shown. Hence my question, who decides? Who decides what becomes visible in public culture and what remains unseen? Okay, so that's a retake of the question, so you replace it with that one. Okay, good. So, ready? Okay, go. So Aisha, how can images and art make pressure visible without turning suffering into spectacle? We've always had this conversation on poverty porn, So I'm asking particularly in your work, in the selection of pieces, media, when you're creating a public exhibition like the ones you've worked on, how do you strike that balance between suffering and spectacle?
I think for me, I try to work with artists that are very sensitive, but also very knowledgeable on the subject matter that they are working on. Okay. And in presenting it, I try to, as I said at first, present the work in its barest possible way. Look at the work first before you understand that perhaps it's about conflict, perhaps it's about loss, perhaps it's about... Because I think when you do that, you don't play around with heavy subjects. You don't turn them into a joke, something digestible, something flippant, something for easy consumption, because it never is easy to go through experiences like that. The trauma sort of lives with you for a very long time until, sometimes it's even many years later that you will realize the impact of that. So it's not a subject that I take lightly at all. And because of that, I try to work with artists that do not take this subject matter lightly at all. And I remember in Ariwa, the exhibition, in the section on conflict, I had 2 paintings. One of them was of a herdsman by Mark Ruang, and another one was of a mother carrying a baby on her back with a soldier's helmet sort of guarding the baby by Mark Ruang as well. And I found this sort of juxtaposition very interesting because, of course, conflict, and there's this powerful painting of the mother carrying the baby and covering it with a soldier's helmet that speaks in a way to the multiple conflicts that we have had in this country. But then also the painting of a herdsman in such a dignified, powerful manner by, a Biron painter who would be... So I think for me, because the subject of suffering is something very real, something that I have witnessed in many iterations, it's not a subject that I take very lightly. And I think that in selection of the artists that I choose to work with, or artists whose presentation of these matters interest me, are artists that are not only intuitive, but artists that do not trivialize the seriousness of this subject. And I think sometimes it manifests in how they treat other people, the artists themselves, or how they engage with other similar stories. And of course, me, to even approach a subject like that, regardless of how intuitive I feel about the subject, is that I pay all due diligence to the subject by learning about it from as many perspectives as possible, by listening to people who have, if it's not something I've experienced, that have actually experienced it, and to present as many experiences and opinions of this suffering as I can. I think in another way as well, in terms of direct curatorial approach or in exhibition making especially, is sometimes selecting works that do not immediately address the conflict. So not only in cliched manner, sometimes works that confront conflict the most are not, if you would look at them at face value, are not jarring in any way. They're not dark. A work I would use as reference is Mark Ruang's painting of the herdsman, where he has this painting of a herdsman in the most dignified manner, walking his flock. And, if you look at the Nigerian way of doing things, or some of the conflicts that manifest on the plateau, for a painting like this to be done by a Biron man is such a strong statement against sort of the conflict that has happened, against the dehumanization of this conflict, where it reduces actual human bodies and actual human experiences into this ethno-religious conflict without dissecting the impact. What does it do to people? What does it really do to their values? What does this displacement really mean? It has just become a subject matter, something for geopolitical gain standing or ethnocentric gain standing, where someone is, seeing, or I'm better than this person, because forgetting that there are real people behind these statistics. There are real people behind this displacement. And I think it makes such a strong sort of rejection of the idea that we cannot live together, whether herdsman or farmer, whether indigenous or non-indigenous, whether Christian or Muslim. And I think for me, that, and back to your first question, when we spoke about the joss of my youth, I think for me, that painting, the artist's position, the beauty of the painting itself, I think it really represents possibility for me. It's a site of possibility. And sometimes when we look at conflict, I think we have to look at what is possible in the wake of the conflict. Because if not, we get stagnant. We become afraid to counter these narratives. We become afraid to hope and project the idea of peace into the spaces that we occupy.
Thank you. So every society keeps archives, whether they are formal archives or informal ones. What can you say about this, particularly Nigeria's experience with archiving the past? What worries you the most about what gets remembered, what disappears, especially after conflict?
I think right now it is the fragility of the internet, right? With everything backed up on the cloud. where are these clouds situated?
Yes.
What happens the day that the clouds melt into rain?
Indeed.
Are we really able to lean on other methods of preserving our memories? And I think that's something that I think about a lot, especially in relation to my current curatorial practice.
Okay.
You know, a lot of times we look at the past and we cry that we did not digitize. Perhaps our ancestors did not write things down enough. They didn't digitize, or they didn't have as early access as others did to ways of digitizing their ideas, the ways in which they lived, and all of that. So we have lost a lot. But also, I think oral traditions are something that we're losing because of, you know, the way we consume and the way we exchange information now. And again, what happens in the possibility that we lose all of these things and we believe the digital space is what then happens? So I think it's finding a communion between the ancestral and what is present in oral traditions, in remembering as little as our family's histories. You know, I was once asked a question, what is your mother's name? And I answered. What is her mother's name? And I answered. What is her mother's name? I answered. And then, you know, what was her mother's name? And I couldn't answer.
Yeah.
And I went home and I asked my mom the same question, and we met the same roadblock. And of course, thankfully, we're able to find an old, like, sort of family tree where we found some more names. But I wonder if, you know, we were taught to remember these names more and created our own family songs. So as much as we think of archiving as something that is big and for the whole world, it can also be something as internal as telling your family's story. Not only in writing, not only in the expectation that your children or your nephews or whoever it is that you relate with will find the pictures or the writings and see them. It's in telling them what you remember. And so I think it's finding a confluence between the mediums, the digital and the ancestral. We learn from our ancestors and we honor what they did, but perhaps we try to create our own ways of remembering. And it doesn't mean that we should let go of the other. Yeah.
Okay. So in this digital age of ours, you know, young people are constantly documenting their lives, as it were, TikTok, Instagram, 100 other platforms. So closely tied with your last response, what responsibility comes with that, knowing that today's content will become tomorrow's memory? Of course, closely related to peace building, young people, you know, but yeah, that's my question.
I think that it is great that young people are able to sort of express themselves and engage with one another in these times of the internet. But I also think that it is important for regulators, not perhaps from a restrictive type of way, but to charge a lot of these companies or these platforms that we use on the internet with a lot more responsibility. For example, you can't as easily stop people from saying the wrong things because sometimes they might not even fully understand the facts, but they're excited to express themselves and they have a platform. So you should have fact checkers. You should have opportunities to correct or to identify dangerous content as well and to mitigate the spread of it. And at the same time, I believe that they have a duty to protect those memories that are shared or archived on their site. I'll give an example with the Yellow Company. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention, let me not get you into any legal trouble, as capable a lawyer as you are. But one of these companies, which I believe many people from my generation and later we use a lot to share quick videos with one another. And suddenly this year they've introduced a payment system. So the initial premise was that you could save your memories on the app for as long as you wanted. And now you have to pay to access those memories.
Yes.
So a lot of people risk losing archives because, again, I believe that our personal memories, our personal experiences are archives.
Yes.
We don't know how quickly the world is changing. I think it's moving at a much faster pace than a lot of us have anticipated. And So when we have spaces where we have documented what the world was, I believe there's a need for regulations to protect them. I also believe there's a need for regulations or an internet system that holds people to account for what they post. Not in a punitive manner necessarily, but in a way of saying this information might not be accurate. This is a part of the information. And I think this comes back to the idea of when we think of building the internet and accessing the internet, and especially as Africans, in what way can we build an internet for ourselves that allows us to archive, but also allows us to treat one another with respect and in fact encourages that sort of internet usage, that encourages an internet usage that is not exploitative as well of people's data, of people's private information. And my friend Uzoma Oji, he's an amazing creative technologist. I think he does a lot of work and has a lot of brilliant ideas around that. But this sort of expansive thinking, I think, is something that we also need to introduce. And in interacting with young people as much as possible, teaching them about the possibility that the internet can be safer, that the internet can be more useful for ours, for their futures, and for futures yet to even begin. Yeah.
Okay. So we often talk about responsible speech, but rarely about responsible seeing. So what does it mean to look ethically at pressure, decline, suffering? And what do we do with this? What do we do with these things?
Earlier, I think I spoke about seeing art.
Yeah.
And I think learning how to properly look at art, for example, is a very good way of teaching you how to responsibly look at things. It's not to force yourself not to cringe when you see something painful. That's not responsible. Seeing. Responsible seeing is to cringe and then be responsive. How can you help stop the pain? You see someone bleeding on the road. What is your first instinct? Is it to bring out your phone and record, or is it to apply pressure on the wound? You respond to a shock, and it's to teach people as much as possible what is the best way to respond to the shock. Do I see a video that's sort of confrontational to me on the internet, and do I first of all try to get more information about where the video is coming from? What are perhaps the person's motivations? Or do I instantly respond in an equally aggressive manner and before I know create conflict that is bigger than that? Is all like a response to seeing. And so I think learning first of all to look at things and feel, even in that split second, feel and then make the most responsible decision. And how do you learn to do that? It's by being open to many experiences. It's by learning about people as much as you can. It's by learning from one another's experiences and seeing that perhaps this world, we all inhabit it together and we have to live in it together. And would I rather choose a path where we all live together and we flourish and we prosper? Or do you choose a path that, perhaps you grow to be the biggest tree, but the entire forest around you is dead? Yeah. And we need to teach, especially younger people, maybe in a way I think that, some people, our generation up were done for. There's no saving anyone. But perhaps with the younger ones, we can teach them that. And I think, as much as a lot of people like to complain about Gen Zs and Gen Alphas and how direct they are, I think that I appreciate how real they are about feeling things and creating responses to that. And so, they keep me optimistic about the future. And they remind me that it is possible to teach us to see things properly, to react, first of all, stop the bleeding, and then try to understand what is causing the bleeding. How can I help? Or perhaps I should call an ambulance. They are better suited for this. And I think we need to sort of take that sort of lesson into our daily lives.
Staying with young people. So for young people navigating social media, the constant imagery, how can they resist that numbness? How can they not become overwhelmed?
And this is where we talk about the responsible internet, an internet that is built on ethics. And I think this is a duty of us and also the regulators, but at the same time, responsible seeing. I think whether we like it or not, the internet has become more democratized. It's something that is accessible to many of us.
Yeah.
And therefore, it is a tool that we need to learn and we need to teach people how to interact with. When you see repeated you should know when to take a break from perhaps sites that are intent on bombarding you with images that make you desensitized to whatever situation, to whatever cause it is that you are interested in. It is providing other opportunities for people to discuss perhaps things they see on the internet. It is even creating more spaces for people to actually go outside and touch grass and come to terms with reality and, not work themselves up into ChatGPT psychosis, which is, really a thing. So I think it's all of us acknowledging that the internet is here to stay, because I think sometimes people think the internet is going to go away, and inculcating a more responsible way of using it, but also holding people that provide platforms on the internet for us to use to account, to regulate how people use the internet, especially younger people. I mean, Australia just passed laws banning children under 16, I believe, from social media use. I think that's a bit too unrealistic and a bit too punitive. But I think that a middle ground
has to be found.
Yeah.
Okay, so my second to the last question. If you had to name one thing societies consistently fail to notice early enough, what would it be?
There are so many things, but I think that I would say the land.
Okay.
I think the land keeps score. The earth keeps score more than anything else. And before things begin to go bad, it's like in the past you hear stories or you read old books and they speak of omens. But I think that somehow the earth always reacts. It's either in things getting warmer, and if you begin to look at the root causes, you would often find that conflict that you're avoiding. It's perhaps in a lack of abundant produce, or it's in the prices of the staple going up, or perhaps it's in ginger disappearing. I think the earth always manifests these things before, and I think we need to pay more attention to the earth and to water and to the natural environment that we've been entrusted with.
So for young people listening across Plateau and Kaduna states and beyond, what is the one way they can train themselves to see pressure clearly before it becomes crisis?
I think, of course, for young people, it's usually there in the conversations that you have with your friends. As I said, for me, one of the first times I noticed that the city I lived in was sort of becoming fractured, or there was a problem, was in little children telling me birthday parties after Christmas. And I think if perhaps we could identify such lines of discourse and such ideas quicker and correct them quicker, we can perhaps broadcast the message even more broadly and sort of show or create a policy, maybe not a formal policy, but just sort of an energy that shows that sort of thinking, that sort of rhetoric is not something tolerable in the places that we live in, and perhaps we can prevent things from escalating, or even really identify perhaps people that have some sort of discontent that can be dealt with in another way. I think sometimes that peace is a decision that we can all choose to make, and we can all work together to make it happen. So I think in vocalizing that choice and sort of learning how to deal with ideas that conflict with ours, or things that we think conflict with ours, I think we can manage to stop these things from happening.
Okay. Thank you so much, Aisha Aliyu-Bima. It's been a pleasure to have you on this podcast.
Yes, thank you very much for your very, very brilliant questions as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
What this conversation leaves us with is a quiet but demanding task: to learn how to see, Conflict does not only grow from events or decisions, but from what societies allow to fade into the background. Environmental damage, shrinking spaces, silenced histories, and everyday forms of pressure that are treated as normal. For young people, prevention begins with attention, with noticing what is changing, what is being erased, and what stories are repeated without question. Images, language, and memory all shape how pressure is better understood or ignored. Peace is not only built through action, but through perception. Learning to see clearly, early, and responsibly is one of the most powerful civic skills that we have. Thank you.